Hey everybody, back with a little bit more content from the Content Minds here on YouTube. Thanks to everybody who was watching and commenting on the last video. Some really interesting comments there related to Kamala Harris's sort of late entry into the race, into the presidential race, and kind of how that might be a strategy you might want to adopt if you're the Democrats or really any party running up against a counterparty with a really cohesive and unified media machine like we see with conservative, with the GOP in the United States. As you guys know, I started this channel to kind of engage with questions like that, really with viewers, right? So that's always really enjoyable for me. And there was some really interesting comments there about, would this sort of delayed onset kind of campaign radicalize parties more? Would it mitigate or kind of exacerbate the problem that we see with a lot of the primary structure in the United States is that kind of really tends to push parties to a more conservative place. Would someone entering the race later kind of make that worse or better? I sort of contended and tend to think that it would, if anything, make it better, because the later in the race you go, the more sort of casuals you bring into any kind of race, right? There's always the sort of adage that the closer you get to Labor Day, the more people kind of tune into a presidential race. But it was an interesting discussion nonetheless. Sort of semi-relatedly, what I wanted to make this video about really was a related issue. Obviously, the talk of the town right now is Tim Walz kind of joining the Harris-Walz campaign. This issue actually that stuck out to me involves his counterpart on the GOP side, J.D. Vance, and one of his backers, actually his sort of one of his financial backers in Peter Thiel, and also one of these kind of tech billionaires who sort of was born on third a bit and now thinks that they're a Max Weber level political theorist. And it was really interesting, some old comments of Thiel's resurfaced related to what he calls the Weimar Republic and the similarities of that period of German history to the current U.S. zeitgeist political paradigm that we're experiencing now. Thiel refers to this government as the Weimar Republic. This is actually a pretty common name for this government. I'll call it the German Republic. The Weimar Republic was a name given to that government by Adolf Hitler, so I tend to kind of shy away from using it if at all possible. Sometimes you have to, just because people don't really know what you're talking about in terms of which German republic are you referring to. But what Thiel said was really interesting and sort of one of those, okay, I'm with you, what are you talking about kind of reactions where somebody sort of has maybe a point that you start, when they initiate talking about it, you're like, okay, I can definitely see kind of where you're coming from, and then as they continue, you realize they're looking at it from sort of a diametrically opposed position to where you might be, or even where logic might live. And what Thiel said really was there are some similarities between the 1920s and early 1930s in the German Republic and in this current state of the political paradigm in the U.S. And to that point in his statement, I was sort of nodding along, saying, "Yeah, I think that's true. There are some interesting similarities." And then he took it to a weird place, right? And basically said, I think his exact words were, "Liberalism being exhausted," and then he had this amazing way of saying it. It was so troubling. He said, and democracy, whatever that is, whatever that means, is exhausted. And I thought that was fascinating, just such a deep and sort of profound misread of what happened during the German Republic, in the sense that it really, the rise of Hitlerism and the fall of representative government in Germany during this period of time really had nothing to do with liberalism or democracy being exhausted, and everything to do with, frankly, incredibly conservative financial and political elites like Peter Thiel, thinking that they could co-opt, commodify, and essentially ride the horse of Hitlerism back to a system of government, a period of time before all these socialists and communists and Republicans and Democrats were part of a government. And I thought this was just so interesting. It reminded me, a bit of the Mark Twain quote about how difficult it is to make someone see something when their financial interest or their career kind of would encourage them not to see it. This guy sitting at the apex of power and money in our society, pointing out that the problems with the German Republican period was the Republican part of it, when in reality, if you start to dig into that period of time, what you find is, really there actually aren't that many similarities structurally and sort of contingently or historically, right? You look at the German Republic of that period was coming off of a catastrophic conflagration, a war that sort of chewed up multiple empires, really destroyed two empires, really a conflict that to that point was the most horrific loss of life, a violent loss of life in human history in some ways. The German state was obviously deeply involved in that defeat and continued to kind of deal with the ramifications of that. Obviously, that's not something that applies at all to the United States in our current moment. There was also a very rich tradition in Germany at that point of autocratic government, the Kaiser kind of running the political show. The term for the chancellor of the German Republic really was the Ersatz-Kaiser, sort of a stand-in or an inheritor to the Kaiser position, right? So you're talking about a group of people who don't have a lot of democratic kind of culture, at least in the sense that we would sort of think about institutions and norms. Those things were all very inchoate, very new in Germany at the time, right? So because of that, there just wasn't this established tradition of hundreds of years of this system working. That's also a huge difference, I think, and just a place in which this comparison doesn't really work that well. So militarily and politically, there's lots of differences. It's also true that at the beginning of the German Republican period, there was a lot of hyperinflation. This was sort of the wheelbarrows full of Reichsmarks to go buy some bread period that I think we all probably learned about somewhat in grade school. But by the end of this period, the Schleicher government in particular was really looking at deflationary policies, and this obviously is the exact opposite of our problem in the United States right now. I won't get too into what that means or why that was happening, but that sort of deflationary strategy really started to undercut a lot of the social services the government was able to provide, and kind of limited the support for a lot of people that would have traditionally been more psyched to support a representative government really were less interested in doing so because of that sort of degradation of social services and just the economic difficulties in general. But again, those difficulties were really the exact opposite of what we're experiencing now. With a relatively strong economy, a relatively strong labor market. Certainly, when you're talking about contingent historical differences, like the German Republic was dealing with the Great Depression, right? I mean, that's just not really that applicable to our current situation at all. When you have the Schleicher and then the Brüning governments pushing for these deflationary policies, it really, skyrocketed unemployment, which is just not, again, really that applicable to what we're looking at in the current economic paradigm in the United States. I think there's a lot of debate right now about, the vibe session and how bad is the economy really. Well, the fact that you have the privilege of having that debate means you're probably not in the Great Depression. So there are all of these contingent and kind of structural and economic and, military differences, cultural differences, huge factors, right, when we compare two polities to one another that are different between America in the 2020s and Germany in the 1920s. What I see, frankly, is the biggest similarity, and the irony, deeply nested within Thiel's comments, is really the similarity is a society riven by a lot of inequity, kind of embodied by these incredibly powerful, incredibly conservative financial elites, right? Economic and financial elites who have incredible access to political power. And Thiel obviously is Exhibit A in this problem, right? He's also Exhibit A sort of in the intellectual fallacy of thinking that the problem with the government is that it's too representative and it's functioning too well to sort of onboard the opinions of marginalized people. That the problem is that it's listening too much to people who it shouldn't listen to, and not, really that those people are someone out there in the voting public, and not that it's listening too much to these, powerful elites like Thiel himself, right? And you see that with the German Republic specifically, with the sort of the von Pappens of the world, who were, really anti-democratic conservatives, Catholic conservatives who wanted to take Germany back to sort of a pre-French Revolution, pre-liberalism kind of environment, really a sort of, an updated kind of monarchy in a lot of ways, right? These were sort of monarchist or pro sort of imperial thinkers, right? Who really saw a lot of problems like Thiel does with the Republican system, and really saw it as decadent and weak, and really effectively tried to sell the problems with that system as related to that decadence, right? That this was weakness, that this was prioritizing artists and intellectuals and homosexuals and Jews, and these were all the people that they sort of saw as undesirable. And Hitler really essentialized that and took the gloves off and said the quiet part out loud, very similar to what Trump has done, right? That we need to punish these people and remove them from any kind of political power to preserve, the power of people like Thiel, right? So really, what you saw emerge out of that, kind of milieu is folks like von Papen who were deeply undemocratic, who had sort of supported coups in his case in the Prussian Free State in 1932. I mean, these were people who basically said, okay, we can use the power of Hitlerism, the sort of populism of Hitlerism, of Nazism, but we can constrain it, we can control it. I think the term that they often used was we can ride the horse. You can start to see how scarily similar this is to this sort of political animals like your Vances, of the world who look at Trump as still somehow somebody that they can control and kind of constrain. Meanwhile, the entire time, the political party that you're trying to constrain him to is really being molded by his whims, by his ideas. This was very, very similar to what happened with von Papen eventually, right? He sort of continued to say that he could control this person and was almost immediately kind of excluded from the structures of power by Hitler, who then used his popularity in a deeply undemocratic way to secure sort of emergency powers and really circumvent the parliamentary system in Germany. It's worth noting that there are, I think, other similarities as well. I mean, obviously, the German Republic and the United States currently are, that was a parliamentary system. This is a presidential system, so it's sort of different in that sense. But it is true that the Nazi Party. In that initial election, when they, right before the Enabling Act, right after the Enabling Act, they didn't win a majority of the votes of the German people, right? They never were really a majoritarian. There was never a majoritarian consensus about putting them in power. They just got enough power that they couldn't be stopped at that point, and the Enabling Act couldn't be stopped. But that election was really riven by a lot of voter intimidation by the SA and other sort of goons and thugs on the part of the Nazis and their allies. And this is again kind of similar to what we've started to see being a concern in swing states, right? That if people don't feel like they can, that their vote will be counted, or that they might be intimidated to not vote a certain way. That's a huge detriment, a huge danger to a representative system. And again, there's only one, political party in the United States who's at all entertaining that kind of activity. Secondarily, I think there's a huge similarity here between how the sort of Ersatz-Kaiser was seen to embody, again, a very, very strong kind of unitary executive, right? If there was danger to the Reich or to the German people, even before the rise of Hitler, it was very much seen as acceptable that person could kind of circumvent a lot of the civil rights of individuals in the country to protect the community as a whole. And again, this is not something that you see in both parties in the United States. You really only see one party pushing for this sort of unitary executive, and that would be the Republican Party. So this is, again, another similarity that is much more salient, much more relevant, I think a much stronger comparison that Thiel just kind of completely leaves out. Another substantial similarity, I think, that we should be concerned about is, a conservative movement that was very much focused on removing or abrogating individual rights, rights to bodily autonomy, rights to privacy that we see. Again, I think this is straining the comparison somewhat because the rights that were under attack from the right wing in Germany were obviously, I would say, more acute, but also we're just focused on different principles. But it is true that only one, really, in my opinion, one party in the United States is at all focused on taking these kinds of things away or taking a consensus around access to healthcare for women, for example, and abrogating that and restricting that. I do think that's a relevant similarity, just in the sense that you want to kind of go back and take away things that have been granted by a representative system. And then finally, I think maybe the most one of the more strained comparisons, but also an interesting one, is just the degree to which the German Republic started to experience, I think it was maybe the last 4 chancellors in a row or something, at least Schleicher, Brünig, and von Papen, and maybe one more that I'm forgetting, were essentially chosen by President von Hindenburg, who was, sort of put in a position structurally to make that decision if and when the parliament couldn't agree on who the leader should be. So that you imagine a very fractured parliament that's responsible for choosing the leader of the country, choosing the chancellor, and they're unable to do that because there's no consensus, there's no ability to compromise or make politically relevant decisions for the German people. But really, this isn't so much a cause, I think, as it's sort of a symptom or an indicator of, like, when you get to this level of dysfunction, this level of inability to come to a consensus, to come to some kind of compromise, these systems have a really, really hard time functioning in that kind of environment. Something like that happening in a one-off way, right? And a leader being kind of chosen out of necessity by the president one time, right? Okay, that was kind of an aberration, not the end of the world. But as this kind of becomes a pattern, right, it starts to break down the entire. Why are we voting? If the parliament isn't even able to ever make this decision for us, it just starts to show a level of dysfunction that's extremely frustrating to the everyday person, and they almost throw their hands up and say, well, what's the difference, right? It doesn't really matter that much. And I think, obviously, again, the structures are very different. I want to do what Thiel did and speak to that and make sure that that's clear, that there are big differences here between the U.S. and the German Republic structurally, certainly, but obviously there's not a von Hindenburg who's going to come in and make a decision about who the president of the United States is. But there is a Supreme Court, there is the House of Representatives. There's several ways in which the president, there is the Electoral College, for example, would be one of these things that might be similar kind of frustration for everyday people, where it's like, wait, every Republican president in my lifetime has not won the popular vote, right? These kinds of things really corrode people's belief and trust in the system. It needs to work to work, and that's kind of the irony of it, right? All happy families are the same, and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. The system really has to represent the people if the people are going to believe that it can represent them, and that's kind of the similarity I'm pointing to here. Is that breakdown really opens up the path for a strongman, opens up the path for a dictatorship, because I think the thinking goes, well, if we're not going to have representative government, we might as well have functional government. And so that would be the final sort of caution I put in there. And I think that's really, to tile this together, it really is the perverse kind of toxic way of thinking that Thiel is embodying here that kind of produces that dysfunction, right? When people really start to think in that hyper-cynical, democracy, whatever that is, kind of way. Well, you know exactly what democracy is, Peter Thiel, like you've lived in one your whole life. So it's that kind of hyper-cynicism and sort of blaming, victim blaming that really drives a lot of that dysfunction. I think, Peter Thiel is obviously a brilliant person. He's a very intellectually talented person. I think what he's doing here, in my mind, is more likely a rhetorical exercise. I'm not sure that he actually is sort of ill-informed enough to not realize parallels between himself and some of these, hyper-powerful elites in the German Republican period. I think it's much more likely that he sort of is, again, looking to sort of improve his own position, get closer to political power, and again, try to co-opt and ride that horse of Trumpism to sort of bigger and better things. I don't think he's unaware of these comparisons. I think he's explicitly kind of going on the offensive to say, if we're blaming, the idea of democracy, then we're less likely to blame me. So anyway, I wanted to kind of get that out there. And again, as always, really looking forward to your comments on it, your questions on it. It really makes me think and had to be smarter myself and look into things more. So thanks again for watching.